Welcome, everyone. My name is Chuck DeZorsi. I'm a Greenways director and a busy gardener in our local forest gardens. I'm glad to see so many people interested in gardens and soil. This is the second garden course we will be presenting via Zoom. The next 3 courses will be Tuesday, May 26th, called Edible Landscaping, Tuesday, June 9th, called Urban Permaculture, Tuesday, June 23rd, called Planning a Winter Harvest. Gardening is one of the best ways to improve your health, upgrade your diet, and if that's not enough, it helps with combating global warming. Elaine Codling is our instructor tonight. She will help provide you with one of the keys to a successful garden, healthy soil. Elaine is a permaculture design consultant and teacher with training in both Canada and Australia. She has been gardening organically for nearly 30 years. Elaine has had a lifelong interest in self-sufficiency, food security, community development, and restoration of natural systems. I've been privileged to have Elaine as a consultant at the Campbell River Hospital Forest Garden and know you will learn a lot from her, especially about soils. If you would like to know more and get involved with Greenways Land Trust and find out about the courses we'll be holding, or just be involved with helping the environment in Campbell River, please have a look at our webpage or Facebook page. Okay, Elaine, over to you.
Thank you, Chuck. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I am going to ask the slides to move. So tonight we're talking about soil. Our focus, so this should be a slide called the framework. Our focus is on growing our own organic food. So we're growing without the use of pesticides, herbicides, or chemical fertilizers. We're working with nature, not against it, and we're specifically growing to eat, right? The third focus, producing a year-round harvest, it's part of the planning is always to try and extend the season for as long as possible, and we're on the coast here where that's really, it's quite possible to garden 10 months of the year and harvest 12 months of the year. So that's something to keep in mind, although we're not going to talk about that now. Next slide is limiting factors. This is sort of a review from our last session where we talked about what do we need to have a garden. We need sun, water, wind. We need to think about wind. We need to think about our soil and our space and time. And tonight, of course, we're focusing on soil. The last little sum up in the next slide is designing success is a little sum up of what we talked about last week. So plant in the sun, make watering easy for yourself, start small and stay close in if you can. Grow things that you will actually eat, things that you want to serve on your table. Make sure you leave a little wild area for the birds and the bees, and then improve your soil. So that's what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about soil. The next slide is any soil can be improved. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind. Even though soil is on that list of limiting factors, any soil can be improved. You can't necessarily do anything about sun if your neighbor's garage is in the way, but you can do something about the soil. So there's no need to buy soil, unless of course you're filling raised beds. And if you are buying soil, it's always worth it to get whatever is the best you can, because you know, most of your cost is in transportation, you know, especially if you're getting a big soil dump with a big truck. But even hauling it around yourself, you might as well get the best you can. The difference in price is minimal. So keep in mind that even the best soil has to be amended, and especially if you're trying to grow veggies year round, you're taking biomass off the land, spring, summer, fall, winter even, and you need to replace that nutrient, that biomass to the soil. The next slide is I'm talking about what is ideal, and this is, you know, nice to keep in mind. Most of us don't have that, but it's good to keep in mind. So while well-drained is hugely important, especially in this part of the world where we have, torrential rain in the winter, and most plants don't like their roots sitting in soggy soil. If there's a high water table, that's really a problem because it eliminates the air space. So your open structure and your texture allows for air exchange. I was looking at something just the other day that was saying soil is 25% air, which blew my mind. I knew it was important, but I didn't realize it. I mean, it seems solid enough, but 25% air. So fertility, that means the nutrients have to be there, available in a form that the plants can absorb. And a good supply of organic matter is always your slow release of nutrients. Probably one of the most important things is that you have a healthy community of soil microorganisms, and we're going to go into that a bit deeper. The other thing that plants need is they need a depth of topsoil. If you've got like a couple of inches of topsoil and then it's all subsoil, that's really, really difficult for plants to extend their roots and to actually get nutrients. So you need a minimum depth of topsoil, and because we're eating, because we're taking biomass off, we're sort of constantly trying to replenish our soils. The next slide talks a little bit more about the soil texture. Loam, it's called. The ideal garden soil is loam. It's the perfect mix of clay, sand, and silt particles. Most of us don't have that. Clay soil is really, really great for nutrients. It holds water, has lots of nutrients, but it's easily compacted, and drainage is a problem. Sandy soil, of course, has great drainage and great aeration, but the water runs away and there's not as many nutrients. So the next slide is structure, sorry. The next slide is structure. And structure has to do with whether or not the soil hangs together. And usually when I teach this in person, I actually get you to handle soil and feel soil. So, when you take a handful of soil in your hand and you squeeze it and then you see the imprint of your hand, you should be able to then touch that and have it crumble. So your structure has to do with the decomposed organic matter, and then the biological activity. It's actually the soil microbes that produce the glue that holds the particles together. The soil life, this is the next slide, is quite amazing. There's a great book called Teeming with Microbes, and it's TEAM, so it's a little bit of a pun, teeming with microbes. And honestly, this is it. This is the key thing, this community of soil microorganisms that feed your plant and that your plants feed. The next slide is life in the soil. And plants actually promote that soil life. Up to 40% of the sugars that plants produce are exuded into the root zone. They're feeding that soil microbiome. It's that important. And your populations of bacteria and fungus near the plants can actually be phenomenally more rich than the ones in the surrounding soil. This one stat I found was 100 times that of surrounding soil. So the soil microbes, and that's the next slide, is really, really important for protecting the plant roots. It's important for providing nutrients in a form that plants can actually use. They stimulate root growth. They make antibiotics to protect the plant. They improve the mineral uptake. It's a symbiotic relationship where the soil microorganisms and the plants are, cooperating for the health of both. So the next slide is the community, meet the community. And there are, a number of different components. The bacteria, which decompose organic matter, they are the ones that are consuming the sugars produced by the plants. They hold the nitrogen, they convert the nitrogen into a usable form. They basically prevent the loss of those nutrients from the soil. The actomyocytes help to break down cellulose and the kind of coarser, the chitin, which is the it's almost like animal fiber. It's the hard shells from insects and things like that. They are amazing because they also help to produce antibiotics. You know, they're just, it's another way of converting nitrogen into a form plants can use. And then finally, the fungi will digest the tougher materials. They tend to be more common in woodsy mulch rather than, you know, fine mulch. The soil microorganisms are amazing, and the list goes on in the next slide. The mycorrhizal fungi basically live in and on the roots, right? And they bring nutrients, and they can actually extend the draw of the nutrients. I have another slide on mycorrhizal fungi, but the protozoa, they eat bacteria, they eat fungi, they excrete nitrogen. About 80% of the nitrogen from plants comes from the protozoa. Nematodes can be good or bad, but nematodes are beneficial. They also eat other nematodes and they excrete nitrogen. All of the visible things, the earthworms, the insects, the mites, are shredders and predators and decomposers. Earthworms can make a phenomenal amount of soil and aerate it. It's, you know, it's a busy plant or plantain animal community under there. The next slide is on the mycorrhizal fungi, because this is one of the things that's relatively new in soil science. Certainly wasn't knowledge that was available to me in the later part of the 20th century. But mycorrhizal fungi actually originally were thought to be a rare, like there were a few plants that paired with mycorrhizal fungi and it wasn't a common thing. And now we know that almost 95% of plants on Earth or more actually pair with mycorrhizal fungi, and they actually feed each other. So the fungi bring water and nutrients to the plants, and of course the plants exude sugars into the root zone. Generally, the mycorrhizal fungi are more common in undisturbed soils, so in shrub beds and perennial beds rather than garden beds where there's more disturbance, although depending on your mulch, you'll find them there. So the problems of soil, the next slide is talking about compaction, poor structure, which can reduce your drainage. And again, you know, when your drainage is poor, the plants are sitting in water, it limits the air exchange. It kills the aerobic microbes and the fungi. Things that cause compaction, the next slide, is handling wet soil. That's one of the things that you'll find in gardening books and gardening references as soon as the soil can be worked. Basically, if the soil squishes or if you make that ball of soil and it's too wet to crumble in your hand, then you don't want to be cultivating. Overcultivation, especially rototilling, can cause problems anyway. And it's one thing to, you know, rototill turf or lawn if you're establishing a garden, but you don't want to be caught up in rototilling year after year because you can really damage the structure of the soil. Other things that can cause compaction, the pounding rain. I really advocate for keeping your soil covered. Nature has a no bare earth policy. That's why weeds come really quickly, and I think it's really an important one that we observe ourselves. So I advocate a lot of mulching. Walking and standing on soil. It's generally better to have your paths be paths and to keep your feet out of the bed if you can. Anything that kills your soil organisms, pesticides, waterlogging, I mentioned, even excessive fertilizers can cause problems, and certainly anaerobic compost. So if your compost or your compost tea smells rank, that's usually because it's anaerobic. And anaerobes are problematic because oxygen is bad for them. They try to keep it out, right? So they actually cause further compaction. So the next slide is actually a slide of a website, and this is information I know you all want for soil tests. I should say that I've never actually done a soil test on my soil. I generally stick to what I can observe, and I've never had problems with my plants to the point where I was like, what's going on? I have to have a test. But they're not expensive, and certainly if you're new or if you're breaking new ground, it's a good idea to get a soil test. My strategy, and the one that I want to encourage you to take on, and what I'm mostly going to be talking about tonight, is your own observation, what you can learn from handling and observing your soil yourself. So absolutely get your soil test. As I said, they're not usually expensive. There isn't a place, that was one of the questions that came up, there isn't a place you can just take your soil to in the valley or in Campbell River. The soil tests that you can buy at the garden centers are a waste of time and money. There isn't really any easy, get a list of all the nutrients in your soil, but you don't necessarily need that unless your plants are having problem. I would just go ahead and plant and see how you do. So observing soil, that's the next slide. There's a number of things. There's weed indicators. There's also just what you can observe by looking in, and there's a couple of really simple kitchen chemistry soil tests that I'm going to share with you as well. So the next slide is about weed indicators, and I should say the thing about weed indicators and most of your observation methods is that they're not definite. They're not like if this then that. They're really a basis for further observation, for questioning, for trying to figure out more about your soil. But some of the things that you can actually find from looking at what weeds are growing are things like whether your soil is acid or alkaline, whether your soil is compacted or has drainage problems. Sometimes you can actually tell about mineral content and fertility. And I have a number of pictures in the next slides of various weeds and what they say. So we'll go on to that. This is just a little caveat saying that, most of this is not definite. The information tends to be suggestive rather than absolutely clear. And I do also have some slides that show about weed combinations, because that can actually be more telling than individual weeds. Next slide, please. The thing about weed analysis is that weeds are, well, they're weeds because they can tolerate a lot of different things. But bindweed, which is really a tough one, generally prefers poorly drained soil. It prefers hard pan, neglected areas. It doesn't tend to like cultivated soil. So if you have bindweed, the thing you can do is kind of go through with a fork and gently lift and pull those roots out. It's going to be constant, but the best thing you can do with when you see weeds or when you have weeds that are a certain kind is pay attention to what kind of soil that is and adjust it. Bindweed's particularly persistent, so it's not maybe a good example. The next one is Buttercup. Buttercup is generally an indication of poor drainage. It likes acid soil. It likes disturbed and cultivated soil. It's a common one in this part of the world because we have so much rain. It does have the advantage of being a potassium accumulator, and it's one of those weeds that you can actually get. You can lift that out with a fork and get the roots out. You can actually deal with Buttercup. The next slide is clover. Clover is a nitrogen fixer, as are all the legumes. So generally, if you've got clover going on, it may be because your fertility isn't good, you have low nitrogen, and that's a nitrogen fixer, so it can thrive. It's actually a very good cover crop. I don't hate clover. I know it can be annoying and it's very persistent, but it's a really good cover crop. So sometimes the best thing to do is just pull the tops off and let that be part of your mulch, and just keep pulling the tops off. The next one is dock. And dock also likes waterlogged and poorly drained soil. Dock is interesting though because it has this very, very long taproot. So it goes right down into the subsoil and it brings up nutrients to the surface. So those leaves on the surface, actually, the best thing to do with dock is just to cut it off and let the leaves lie and be part of your mulch. It actually draws up calcium, potassium, phosphorus, and iron from the subsoil. And it helps to improve soil structure. And it's got such a long taproot that you're never going to actually get it. So you can kind of just give yourself a break. Don't even try. Just whenever you see it, just, you know, snip the leaves off and let them lie there and become part of your mulch. The next one is horsetail. Horsetail is also very difficult because it's persistent. It's got super long roots, like 60 feet long roots. It generally likes light, sandy, and again, acidic soil. So that's a common one as well. It does actually neutralize the acid. It's a bioaccumulator of metals and nutrients like silicon and magnesium. Interestingly, because it's got such a long taproot, or such a long root system, I won't say a taproot, it doesn't actually compete with your vegetables for nutrients. So even though you might not like it, you don't have to put a lot of effort into getting rid of it. It's another one that I usually just pull in handfuls and leave on top as mulch, because those minerals are actually good for your other plants once it's been cut. Plantain is the next one. This is another one. Plantain is called Band-Aid plant. It's actually quite a good one for bee stings, the spider bites, various things. It helps to draw out. It's a really good one. It really likes compacted soil. You'll often see it growing on the corners of driveways and stuff like that. Places where the soil is acidic, generally low fertility. It's also a bioaccumulator of nutrients and helps to neutralize acids. I actually love plantain because it's so good for insect bites, but even cuts and things like that. The next one is quack grass. Quack grass, there's not much redeeming value to quack grass, sorry, but it is an indication of heavy clay and poor drainage. And the one thing that it's actually good for is that it can help prevent erosion on slopes. Definitely not my favorite, but you know, the point is, if you have these weeds, then it's telling you something. Poor drainage, heavy clay. The next one is sorrel. It's also likes acid soil. It's also an accumulator. Sorrel is another one that this is the one that has the roots running underground. So there'll be like a long root with various stems. It's a sheep sorrel, I would say, because there's also a sorrel that's a perennial vegetable. Anyway, following one is thistle. Thistle definitely likes heavy compacted soil, abused soil. Thistle is like a yellow and black police tape that says, stay out, you've done enough damage here, stay out. The best results I've had with thistle is improving the soil and then constantly digging it, but really, really improving the soil as much as you can, because that sort of weakens it, and it doesn't, the soil as it becomes healthier doesn't need it anymore. So the following one is vetch. Vetch is part of the same family as clover, so it also thrives in low nitrogen and low fertility. It's a good nitrogen fixer, cover crop, and it is also a bioaccumulator. This is another one that you're probably not going to get any root. It breaks off really easy at soil levels, so you're going to probably try to not let it flower, don't let it make seed pods, because it'll be everywhere. Just tear it up and let it be part of your mulch. So the next slide talks about the limits of weed analysis. As I said, these things are suggestive, not definitive. These are things that you can look at and go, I've got all these acid-loving weeds, or is it maybe my soil needs some lime, right? So it's food for thought and more observation, and you may decide that you need to do a soil test or something like that. But the problem with weed analysis is that there's a lot of variation depending on where the weed is growing, and often weeds will tolerate quite a wide range of conditions. The health of the weeds is probably just as interesting as the fact that they're there. Chickweed, for example, in when you find a really lush bit of chickweed, it's because the soil is very fertile, but chickweed will grow and look pathetic in places where it's not fertile, so that's good to know. And generally the weed communities, which is our next slide, So I've got a slide here that says a combination of weeds that you're going to find in wet, moist soil. There's the next slide is a combination of weeds that you're going to find in dry and sandy soil. I have, interestingly enough, I have the Buttercup. There's like, I have two at Lake Trail, but they don't actually inhabit the same zone. The next slide is the soil that you're going to find in heavy clay soils. And then after that, we have hard compacted soils. So I have, for example, sheep sorrel in some places at Lake Trail, and then I have Queen Anne's lace in other places at Lake Trail, and they don't tend to inhabit the same zones. So even in your own garden, you're going to have places that are more or less acidic or more or less compacted, various things like that. So paying attention to things like that. So that's the hard compacted soil. The next one is the poor and low fertility soil. You'll see that the Queen Anne's lace is there. Queen Anne's lace also likes more alkaline soils. The next slide, dandelion, sorry, before we go on to the next slide, dandelion is one of those that will grow almost anywhere that anything can grow. Dandelion's not actually a weed, but you know, we tend to have control issues, and it does spread like a weed, so it's considered problematic. The next slide is fertile, well-drained, and humus soils. And these are soils, this is like garden soil, right? So these weeds, you know, purslane, lamb's quarters, you're going to find those in your garden. The next one is acid or alkaline, a list of things that tend to be in more acid soils on one hand, and then things that tend to be in more alkaline soils. And as I said, the sheep sorrel is acid. I have that at Lake Trail in one spot. I also have the Queen Anne's lace, but they don't seem to cohabit. So that's pretty interesting. There's a couple, the next slide has a couple of resources on weed indicator if you want to look further at, you know, the weed indicator thing. I think it's well worth paying attention to the weeds just to give you an idea. So we'll leave that now and go on to some of the things that we can do to pay attention. I already mentioned that the lab tests are relatively affordable, and you know that you're going to have to, where it gets expensive is you're going to have to take samples from various parts of your garden. So most areas of the coast are acidic, but on the other hand, this island is largely limestone too. So, you know, you're going to find differences. The thing is that pH can affect the absorption of nutrients, so it's well worth considering. Hang on half a second, sorry. I'm doing my lecture. Okay. Sorry about that. The next slide then is a chart that shows you where most things are easily absorbed is in the neutral zone. So your ideal soil is very slightly alkaline, but getting into the neutral zone is what you're after. So we'll leave that and go on to digging in. And this is where it kind of gets interesting for me. The next slide is about how and what you can find by digging in. So I would encourage you to take a shovel to various beds. You may have some beds with landscaping plants and some beds with garden plants, and you may even want to dig around in places where you're thinking of putting the garden. How easy is it to dig? If your soil's been exposed to pounding rain, it's likely to be quite heavy and hard to dig. That's an indication of compaction. You can look at the texture and the structure. You can look at the color. One of the things you can tell your topsoil depth is by the color. The color will change when you get to the subsoil. So how much topsoil do you actually have in any given spot? That's really important to know. And then what do you see visible life? What do you see as far as earthworms and bugs and things like that? Because if you have a healthy community of visible life, it's more likely that you have a healthy microbiome as well. So take your shovel, dig around in your garden in various places and in various places in your yard and have a look and handle the soil. It's a really, really good practice to do. The next slide is the dirty fingernail test. And this is a matter of holding it in your hand, as I was mentioning before, holding it in your hand, squeezing it, rolling it, feeling it, like what is the texture. If it's smooth and slippery, that's an indication that it might be clay. If it's gritty, it might be sand. You can probably see whether there's decomposed organic matter in it. You can smell it. Old farmers, they will just taste it. They'll, like, with their tongue, and you can actually taste if the soil is acidic or if it's sweet. So, the squeeze and roll test, the dirty finger School of Soil Analysis is one that I'm really keen on. And if you were here in person, I would be handing around soil samples for you to do that. So I really encourage you to do that as well. When you're out there with your shovel, actually get your hands in the soil and feel it and smell it and do the squeeze and roll. If you can squeeze it in your hand and have it take the shape of your hand, you should be able to poke it and have it crumble. If it doesn't crumble, try rolling it just like you used to do plasticine when you're in grade school. If you can roll it, that's clay. If you can coil it up, and that means clay. If it's just sand and grit, then you're definitely have a whole different soil to deal with. The next slide then is the water test. And I've got a few slides showing pictures that I took. It's difficult to see if I could, show you this, because again, this is hands-on when we're in person. But when you do the water test, you're going to be able to actually see 4 different levels. The floaters, generally the organic matter floats, the sand and gravel sinks, and then the silt and the clay layer will show. So the next slide shows your lump of soil in your jar. The next slide shows it all shaken up. Yeah, just jar of water, lump of soil, shake it up. Let it sit. You can see, go back one, please. Lydia, thank you. You can see here in this one, you can see that the sand and gravel has sunk. You can see that there's a little layer of floaters on top. That's your organic matter, and then it takes forever to clear. So you just leave it sitting on your counter there. The next slide now, please. And that, I got as close as I can. It takes forever for this to develop, but you can just see on the surface, it's finally sunk, the water is clear, and you can see this silt layer, right? So that gives me a sense of what my soil has. It's got a little bit of organic matter. It doesn't need a lot, but it does need organic matter. It's got some sand and gravel, it's got a bit of clay, and it's got the silt. So that's a really good soil test to give you a sense. If you don't have any organic matter, that's a problem. If you let it sit for days and your silt is very, very tiny, that's also a problem. But soil can be improved, and generally it's a matter of just adding more organic matter and letting those soil microorganisms do their thing. So the kitchen pH test is next. Next slide, please. Yes. So basically, you're trying to figure out whether your soil is acid or alkaline, and this will tell you at least as accurately as a test that you will buy for $20 in the garden center. This is at least that accurate. So basically, the same soil sample, you're going to put vinegar. You can use high acid pickling vinegar, or you can use apple cider vinegar, or whatever you've got. You're going to use vinegar in one jar, and you're going to use baking soda, which is alkaline, in the other jar. So 2 big heaping tablespoons of baking soda in water, and then you're going to place a spoonful of your soil sample in each jar. And what you will find, you're going to watch and listen, because you will see it just start to fizz. If it's reacting, if it reacts, if it's alkaline soil, it will be the acid that starts to fizz. If it's acid soil, it will be the baking soda that starts to fizz. So watch and listen after you've stirred it up. There'll be a little fizz either way just because you've stirred it, but there should be an ongoing little fizz. So you can actually tell whether you're acid or alkaline. And if you're really, really close to neutral, there may not be much action in either one of them. And that's good. That means that you're not extreme and you don't have to worry too much about it. Okay, next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the various nutrients that your plants need. I've got the list of primary and secondary nutrients. Primary nutrients are nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, potassium. Your secondary nutrients, magnesium, which you get from your dolomite lime, your sulfur, and then your micronutrients you get from kelp and rock dust. The thing about the micronutrients is there really isn't, unless you're actually a soil scientist or you're really, really keen, there isn't really any advantage into trying to figure out how to dose up the various micronutrients. What you want to do is give your soil lots of good compost and make sure that you have a healthy soil microbiome, and then let the micronutrients take care of themselves. Having said that, I have read some really interesting stuff about boron and some really interesting stuff about selenium. So certainly there's room for doing more research on those kinds of things if you're interested. It's not necessary, but it is, if you're interested, go for it. So nitrogen, which is needed for growth, that's the next slide. It's needed for growth and it's needed for chlorophyll, and you can see nitrogen deficiency sometimes when you're looking at plant starts in the garden center, especially late in the season. You'll see that the leaves are kind of turning a wee bit yellow or something like that. The thing about nitrogen is that too much is going to get a lot of leaf growth. The leaves are going to be thin and big, and you're not going to get good fruit production. So too much nitrogen on your tomatoes, you're not going to really get good tomatoes. You're going to get big leaves and very abundant leaves, but not much tomatoes. And too little, as I said, the plants will be weak and sort of yellowish looking. Next slide, nitrogen still. Nitrogen is not from soil. Nitrogen is from the atmosphere, and it's absolutely essential that you have soil bacteria that can basically transform the atmospheric nitrogen into a form that your plants can access. And what they do is they create that nitrogen by feeding on the organic materials, and when they die, they release the nitrogen and the plants can get it. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of different forms of nitrogen, ammonia and nitrates. So ammonia is preferred by perennials. It's common in fungally dominated soil, in coarse woody mulch, in undisturbed soil. Generally your perennial beds, not your annual garden beds. The nitrates are generally preferred by your annuals, and they're more common in bacterially dominated soil. So soil that you're disturbing, soil that you're cultivating is not going to have fungal life or as much fungal life, but it's going to have bacterial life, which is what your plants prefer anyway. Tends to be a lighter mulch, more fresh and cellulose mulch. Basically hot composting and green manures give you those bacterially dominated soils. So the next slide is conserving nitrogen. So under anaerobic conditions in soil or compost, microbes convert usable nitrate into atmospheric, and it's gone. So your gas form of nitrogen, if you've got anaerobic soil, if you've got compacted soil, when you have heavy rains, the nitrogen is leached out of the soil, and manure piles and compost piles left uncovered in the winter, you're going to lose your nitrogen really, really quickly. So one of the key things here that we can use as a specific technique is we can always add our compost, add our finished compost, add our nutrient to the soil in the spring before we plant, rather than in the fall after everything has been put to bed. And it's really important that we pay attention to this, because it is actually it's an environmental pollutant when it leaves your garden. So you want to keep your nitrogen for your plants to keep them healthy and not have it spread out. One of the things you can do if you have slope that you can use is, if you know that nitrogen is going to wash out of your compost, have your compost above your garden, so that when the nutrients run out, they run out downhill into your garden rather than away from your garden. Next slide, please. Oh, that's conserving nitrogen. Okay, so, no, phosphorus. Okay, good. So phosphorus is needed for root growth, for flowering, for fruiting, for ripening, for seed production. Again, there's problems with too much. There's problems with too little. If you have too much, it limits the uptake of other essential nutrients. If you have too little, the leaves kind of go bluish green, and your fruit can be more bitter and acidic tasting. So the best sources for phosphorus are rock phosphate and bird droppings and bone meal. And this is part of the reason why I say leave a little wild area or something for the birds, because the birds will always leave a little present. They may come and eat your seeds, but they will leave a little present of phosphorus behind, and that's a good thing. The next slide is potassium. Potassium is really important for disease resistance, for root growth, for fruit production. Again, you can have too much and can cause a bitter taste. If you have too little, you can get brown spots or leaf tip curl, various things. I have a slide coming up that can show various nutrient deficiencies. Your other minerals, the next slide is other minerals. Calcium, magnesium, sulfur, copper, iron, zinc, boron, all of those. There's a good reference on nutrients, mineral nutrients from Primal Seed there. As I said, generally with the micronutrients and the secondary nutrients, it's not that useful to try and get into mixing and making sure that you've got the exact amounts of things. If you feed your soil will feed your plants, and that's really the simplest thing to do. So the next slide is about detecting soil deficiencies, and this is corn. Now, I want to say again, this kind of information is observation for further investigation, because you may see this nitrogen deficiency symptom on your leaves. It might be a deficiency in your soil, but there may be some other reason why your plant is not getting that nitrogen. The best example I can think of is calcium deficiency in tomatoes. If you have a calcium deficiency in your soil, your tomatoes get what they call blossom end rot. Thing about it is you can have perfectly adequate calcium in your soil, and when your tomatoes get blossom end rot, it's because of uneven watering, because the tomatoes have not been able to uptake or process the calcium appropriately. So when you look at the leaves of your plants, you know you've got a problem. You have an indication of what that problem might be. The last two leaves on the right are particularly important because one shows disease and one shows sunburn, right? So those are not nutrient deficiencies, and that's a different approach. But even with nutrient deficiencies, it might not be the soil. So all of these things, as I said earlier, are information for further investigation and for further reflection and for thinking things through. They're not if this, then that. That's not how it works. Gardening and any biological system is way too complex for that sort of thing. So having said that, that's information that's useful, and we'll go on to the next section, which is feeding the soil. This is probably the good stuff, what you've all been waiting for. So organic matter, and I'm really big on feeding the soil with finished compost as much as possible. You're feeding those microorganisms, you're not feeding your plants. You know, that's one of the things we have to really get out of our heads. We're not cultivating those plants, we're cultivating the soil, and the soil is what's producing the plants. So organic matter provides slow release nutrient to plants as it breaks down. It improves the water holding capacity. It improves the aeration of clay soil. It actually improves the holding capacity of sandy soil. When it becomes humus, when it's fully broken down, it improves the soil structure. It helps to hold carbon and sequester carbon into the soil, and it provides homes for your beneficial insects and bacteria. So your sources of organic matter are compost and leaves. Oh, this is the next slide, Lydia, thank you. Compost, leaves, all of your plant roots. One of the things I really encourage you to do with anything except your root vegetables, of course, is when you're harvesting, don't dig up the roots. Just cut your plant off carefully at ground level and let that root go back to the soil. Even with something like a cabbage that has a really, really thick stem and heavy root, next year when you go to plant that bed, you'll just have this little, you know, short 2-inch little plug to wiggle out of the soil with no effort at all. And if you spend the time and effort digging up that root, you're taking away a lot of biomass and you're taking away a lot of soil. And then what are you going to do with it? You're going to throw it in your compost, haul it to the compost, and then when it's decomposed, eventually haul it back. So, you know, keeping as much biomass in the soil as possible, cut that plant off at ground level and let those roots rot and provide organic matter for your soil. Garden waste and yard waste and manure. There's only a couple of kinds of manure, alpaca and rabbit, you can put directly onto your soil. Everything else has to be fully composted because it can burn. There are commercial compost products. There's the sea soil, there's the fish fertilizer. These are the morts from the salmon farms. There's also the rocket, which is basically, they used to call it mill organite. It's sewage. It's waste that's been turned into soil. Both are problematic in different ways. But, you know, there aren't any really great choices when it comes right down to it. So those are decisions you have to make. We did have a number of questions about seaweed, and I just want to talk about seaweed briefly, even though I don't have a slide for seaweed. Seaweed is awesome for soil, and you can use it. I would put it on in the spring, just like I would put on any nutrient. You don't want to be harvesting seaweed during herring season. That's the absolute no. And you don't have to process it at all. You don't have to wash it. You don't have to compost it. You don't have to do anything. You can also put it on later in the season as a top dressing. Just, you know, make sure it's not resting up against your plants. It's a really, really good thing. It does melt away really, really quickly. So the couple of times I've actually put it on in the fall and winter, it just sort of disappears into the soil. And I think it's probably, some of it is helpful and some of it is wasted. So I try to avoid doing that if I can. Definitely do not be gathering seaweed in herring season, and be prepared that you're going to find bits of all kinds of things. If you're using seaweed, you're going to find bits of plastic and bits of you name it in the seaweed. So that I hope answers the question on seaweed. The next slide is mulch. And as I said earlier, I really, really believe in a no bare earth policy. Nature has a no bare earth policy. If you leave the soil bare, you're going to get a flush of weeds to cover up the soil as quickly as you can. You could avoid that by covering up the soil yourself with either, you know, seeding it with weeds that you would prefer, you know, whether that's salad greens or radishes or something that grows quickly and covers the soil. But you can also just mulch, and I really, really would encourage you to make mulching part of your normal gardening practice. It builds up and preserves the topsoil. It suppresses the weeds and grasses. It reduces compaction from rain. In fact, the one thing that I do in the fall, and this is important, is I make sure I've got a thick layer of leaves, ideally leaves if I can get it, but anything a bit coarser, like straw if you have to. Straw's expensive, but not hay, because that's way too much weed seed. Anything that you can use to cover the soil with a good thick layer of something that is not going to break down before the rains stop in the fall. Generally stuff that's coarser than you would normally use in the summer, but just to keep the pounding rains from compacting your beds. Mulching is really great because you can use your garden waste directly. I said in last week's class that any inedible biomass that you are harvesting, like when you cut a lettuce, you take those outer leaves that you're not going to eat anyway and you leave them right there. Even weeds, if you've got a good layer of mulch, most weeds can just be left on top, unless they're seedy or if they're going to reroot. If the soil is bare enough that they can reroot, or if the day is wet enough that they can survive and reroot, or if they're going to, leave seeds, then you don't want to leave them on the mulch. But any leafy matter, you can just leave it on top of the mulch. And you can also use mulch to create your raised beds. There's a couple of methods, the lasagna gardening method, and then there's also the straw bale method, where you're basically using and planting directly into partially decomposed mulch that has some soil for your plants, directly where your plants are being planted. So mulching is a really, really good technique. The next slide is actually a little tiny bit about composting. I actually had to edit out most of what I was going to say about composting for time constraints. And I can see that we're getting close to time anyway. So composting is a technique that you really want to master. It's a really important one for food gardeners. The difference is that, if you're doing ornamental landscaping or, not taking biomass, when you're eating, you're taking a lot of biomass away all the time. So you constantly have to be adding compost. And composting is a matter of kind of speed decomposing, mixing brown stuff, dry brown, carbon-based stuff with green stuff, wet, high nitrogen, damp stuff. You really have to get your aeration and your moisture accurate. And there's two ways to do compost. The hot fast is the bacterial dominated compost, and you can, if you use a compost thermometer and turn it every 3 days, you can probably have compost in a couple of weeks. The other is the slow cold fungal dominated compost, and in that you build the pile and you leave it, and you can have compost next season. I can't really spend too much time talking about composting. It's a whole lecture in itself, but there's lots of references out there. Keep in mind that smaller pieces decompose more quickly. So one of the things you can do in your kitchen before you throw things in the compost bin is just take your knife and whack it up into little pieces. And I would say that bins are easier to manage than heaps because they hold the compost together. One consideration is rats. So keeping animal waste products out of the compost, and even if you're just composting vegetables and kitchen scraps, having a rat-proof compost is a serious advantage. So the next slide, and I'm sorry about going over that so quickly, but the next slide is an option if you don't have a rat-proof compost bin. A worm bin can be used for kitchen waste, and then your yard waste is all that goes into your compost outside, and that's much less attractive to rats. So it's very compact. You can do it indoors. You probably have fruit flies, but that's not a big deal. It's really good for kitchen scraps, and the leachate, the liquid that accumulates, is a super valuable resource. It's a very, very concentrated nutrient for plants, and you can use it in your house plants. You can use it in the garden. And it's also, a vermiculture bin is an excellent place for sprouting seeds. You'll often find things sprouting in the vermiculture bin because it's just such a great environment for things. So in terms of found vegetables, your worm bin is going to be a good place to look for things to plant into your garden. The next slide is aerated compost teas. This is really, really important consideration when you are making a compost tea. Without aeration, you're basically making an anaerobic liquid that is going to encourage anaerobic bacteria in your soil and soil compaction. So aerating compost tea is really, really important. You need a little compressor. If you've ever seen the film One Man, One Cow, One Planet, they're doing it in India. They're up all night stirring it vigorously and taking turns stirring it vigorously. So it needs to be thoroughly aerated for 24 hours, and it needs to be used within a couple of hours. It's a great way to help out plants that are ailing or have pests or anything like that. You can actually put it in a watering can and pour it over the leaves. It's a really good nutrient, so well worth investigating how to do that. The next slide, a little bit of a recipe here. This is from Steve Solomon's Growing Vegetables West of the Cascades, and one of the things you'll see about this little recipe is it looks like pet food. It looks like something that you would feed animals. And in fact, it is. This is food for your soil microorganisms. So you're going to take that mix and you're going to take a little tiny pinch of the mix, and you're going to sprinkle. I can't get this to show my hand, but sprinkle it very, very lightly along the side of your rows. And you're not going to do it very often. You might do it once a week, or you might do it once every 2 weeks, but basically a little bit of extra nutrient for your soil microorganisms. So the next slide, and we're almost at the end now, and I can take questions. The green manures, I don't necessarily recommend growing a green manure crop for gardeners because, well, they have to be turned. The soil has to be turned. They have to be uprooted and turned at a very specific time. You can't let them take hold. If you're a farmer, that's your job. You're going to get out there in whatever weather and get it done because you have to. But you know, right now we have lots of time, but life gets busy, and the green manure, you know, if you've planted fall rye or something like that, that takes hold as a weed really easily if you don't get it turned right away. You can grow mulch. There's a number of different plants, whether it's artichoke, which has the big leaves, or comfrey. I know a lot of people hate comfrey, but I don't. I like it. You just have to keep it cut down. Various things like the dock that I showed you is also organic matter. You can grow nitrogen fixing vegetable crops. So all of your peas, all of your beans, those are all nitrogen fixers, and you can grow them in a crop rotation. Or one of the things, especially if you have seeds, old seeds, or an abundance of, you know, pea seeds from a crop that just didn't get harvested, is plant them really early in the spring and mow them down when you're ready to plant something else in that bed. Your bioaccumulators, so lots of those weeds I mentioned are making minerals available. There's a number of other plants, as I said, artichokes, comfrey, horseradish, you know, anything that has long tap roots that go to the subsoil and big leaves, those are bioaccumulators. And then, as I said, plant a little for the birds and keep a little wilderness to get that phosphorus. And that's pretty much it. Our next slide is a summation of what we're going to do to have better soil. We are going to grow mulch and nitrogen fixing legumes. We're going to attract birds. We're going to add compost. We're going to sheet mulch and practice no dig methods. No dig is where you keep that soil soft with your mulch, so you just have to rake back the mulch and plant right into it, or you cut your vegetables off at ground level when you harvest them so that you don't have to dig those out. We're going to add lime or eggshell if you need to change the pH, to raise the pH. use organic fertilizers. That's that recipe that I gave you. Start a word bin, use soil probiotics. These are our resources and the techniques that we can use to improve our soil. And the final slide then is just some references. Teaming with Microbes is well worth, this is science, but it's written for lay people, so it's well worth reading. Steve Solomon, Growing Vegetables West of the Cascades, he's in the Willamette Valley, which is in Cascadia. It's quite a bit farther south, so you know his dates of when to plant and when to do various things have to be adjusted, but it's good information. Rodale Press has some excellent resource materials. This one is a pamphlet on composting that you can just download. So that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions. I know there were a number of questions about the seaweed. I hope I answered that one. There was also one that I still haven't answered about companion planting. And I just want to remind you that companion planting will be covered when we talk about edible landscaping, which I believe is 2 weeks from today. So are there questions I can answer?
Yes. Hi, Elaine. Hi, everybody. My name is Lydia, and yeah, lots of people have sent in questions, and indeed seaweed was like the top runner, but we have more. So there is, for example, and I'm assuming that Pat joined us also, she sent in a question regarding the adjustment of pH for blueberries. And yeah, she's wondering if that is something that's necessary to grow blueberries and how to do it in an organic way, and if it's best to do in the spring or in the fall.
Well, I generally prefer to do soil amendments in the spring. With a perennial crop like blueberries, I wouldn't worry as much about that, because if the soils leach out, you know, they're leaching into the root zone of the blueberry. Having said that, if the blueberry is dormant, it's not going to take it up as well. We live in a fabulous climate for growing berries. Growing berries is easy in this part of the world because we have such a great climate for growing blueberries and any kind of berries. Blueberries like acid soil. We tend to have acid soils. And if your soil is not acid, peat moss is a really good top dress for your blueberries. Coffee grounds are slightly acidic, and I wouldn't necessarily put a lot of any of these things on the blueberries, but I would, you know, periodically do a little top dressing, so a little bit of peat moss or something like that in the spring, and maybe, you know, after the berries, another little shot of something after the berries have been produced. Yeah, I don't think you'd have too much trouble even if you did nothing with blueberries. The one thing blueberries don't do well with is a very high dry slope. They want to be somewhere where they are fairly moist. Their roots are quite near the surface, so they can actually handle a high water table, and they don't want to be anywhere where they're drying out over the summer.
Awesome. Thank you, Elaine. There's a question that also is regarding the cultivation of blueberries. It's a question from Darla J, and she's wondering if in the spot that she's now growing raspberries, she would like to grow blueberries there, and she's wondering how she can transition the soil, if that needs any amendment at all.
I don't think so. As far as I know, raspberries and blueberries are pretty tolerant of the same conditions. The biggest challenge is going to be actually removing the raspberries because they are persistent. I have done it successfully, but generally it's not just a one-shot deal. Like you dig up all those raspberries and the next spring you're going to be digging up more raspberries. The thing is, you might want to actually delay planting your blueberries in that spot until you've had a chance to have a second go at the raspberries. But I don't think their soil requirements are very different. I think they'll be, if the raspberries are happy in that spot, the blueberries are likely to be happy in that spot too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Elaine. And we have a question from Jerry. He's wondering, yeah, he was interested in the seaweed topic too. I hope that Jerry found his answer in what you said earlier. But then his second question is regarding composting. And he says that he would like to know if you think that kitchen waste that has been decomposted in a green cone digester can also be used to amend soil.
I saw that question and I was a little confused because my understanding of those green cone composters is that you set them up right where you want the nutrients to go. So you set them up in a perennial bed, or you set them up somewhere where, you know, that basket underneath the green cone is for the nutrients to leach out into the soil. Mm-hmm. So I don't see any reason why not. If you've been putting animal waste, pet waste into it, you definitely don't want to use it on anything you're eating. You want to use that on your landscape plants rather than on your food plants. If you've been putting a lot of animal products into it, like not pet feces, but you know, things like meat scraps and bones and things like that, you want to make sure that it's fully decomposed before you do that. But my understanding with the green cone is that you set it up wherever you want those nutrients to go and you just leave it, and you don't actually ever have to dig it up or spread the nutrients around.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, so Jerry, if you're listening, I hope that helped. And then we have another participant here, which is Jan, or Jan. I don't know how to pronounce your name, sorry, Smith. And the question is, I'm just going to read it out full. Given that lawns are part of urban landscapes, how do we best support soil under grasses and clover? They are minimizing the parts of their yard already that are lawn, and they have 9 Douglas fir. So most of the yard is quite shady and the soil gets only a little bit of water. And yeah, they can see the soil being blown around on windy days, and yeah, especially after the lawn got mowed. And if you would have any suggestions.
Well, one thing I would say right away is that I'm not really the best person to ask about lawns. So that's, you know, you're going to want to find someone who knows lawns better than I do. But I do have a suggestion for under your fir trees, which is woodland strawberries. That is their natural habitat. They make a great ground cover that will hold your soil in place. You're not going to get big, luscious, you know, harvests of a lot of strawberries. You'll get a few little nibbles of strawberries that you can walk by, but it's a really, really great crop. It's one of the few things that will actually survive under those trees and hold your soil together. So an occasional nibble of strawberries and better soil.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, that's
I hope it helps.
Yeah. Okay. And there is more from Jan or Jen, and that is regarding cardboard use in lasagna gardening. Does cardboard block oxygen transfer?
It shouldn't. I mean, the thing is that corrugated cardboard, I mean, mycelium love it because those little corrugations are like a superhighway for the mycelium to go through in the fungal thing. And cardboard breaks down very quickly in the rain. So I don't think it's a problem. I've never found it a problem. I've sheet mulched in the fall and generally it's gone by the time I want to plant in the spring. I've also sheet mulched in the spring and just cut holes in the cardboard to plant into. Mm-hmm. I've never found that it was a problem.
Okay.
Oh, excuse me.
You're good.
It just breaks down too quickly for it to cause any problems. Okay, sorry, Lydia, go ahead.
Oh, all good, all good. I just don't have questions. Do you want a second Elaine, shall I just mute you?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, I'm just gonna do that. Okay, I'm just gonna, you can wave at me when you're back. Okay, and then you're okay, okay. We're all new to this, so bear with us. Awesome, okay. Yeah, is there anything that they need to do to mitigate the effects of using cardboard? Or she's saying that you mentioned subsoil. How does it differ from topsoil? Do you remove subsoil to make room for topsoil?
No, it's just part of the structure of the earth. The subsoil is the part that is non-living.
Yes.
And the topsoil is where your microbiome, where your living creatures are. And what you want is just to keep adding on top to feed those microorganisms. The cardboard is basically wood pulp. The thing that you would be concerned with this time of year is actually getting it wet. Sorry. You really want to soak it. You want to soak it really, really well because it's dry at this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
It can actually suppress weeds better, but it can also really draw moisture from whatever you're planting. So you really, really want to make it soaked. Generally better to do sheet mulching in the fall if you can, but just a lot of water.
Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry, Elaine.
Yeah, I just talk too much, I guess.
That was too much talking. Shall you want to tackle one last question?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
I have one from Kim, and I know she's not listening, but she will be listening in to our recording later on. Kim is on the Greenways board, and she is going to tackle growing plants in like a smaller space, and she's looking into do container gardening. So she's wondering yeah, if growing plants that need well-drained soil is a mix with sand recommended, like rosemary, is that something that would need that?
Generally with plants in containers, it's a lighter soil mix. At the garden center, they will actually sell you potting mix. You can't just dig soil out of your garden and put it in a pot. It's too heavy. What happens is as you water, and because you have to water more in a container, it really compacts and it makes it difficult for the plants. So something to lighten the soil. Generally, it's just easy to buy the potting mix.
Yes.
The other thing you can do is you can try to water from below. So rather than pouring your water on the soil above, fill the saucer that the plant is sitting on with soil. You don't want that plant sitting in water all the time. You actually want that saucer to clear, but it can help prevent the nutrient loss in container plants. But some kind of lighter soil, and if you can water from the bottom. Generally with container plants, you're going to want to add some liquid organic fertilizer or something like that to your water, because you're watering and the water is draining and you have to keep watering a lot more, and there's less room for the roots of the plants to spread out looking for nutrients. So you're going to have to fertilize.
Yeah, yeah.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that totally does answer the question. Thank you. That's
okay. I think I'm okay now. If there are more questions, I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, okay. I have one that is completely different from what we tackled so far, and it's not too much soil related, but it's an interesting one actually. There's Doreen Anderson. She's wondering how to get rid of wood bugs from your garden.
Oh, good luck. Try not to have, like if you have wooden beds, if you have wooden raised beds, you're going to have wood bugs. If you have wooden mulch, if you have any rotting wood, you're going to have wood bugs. So generally wood bugs don't go after living plant matter. They go after decomposing plant matter. The problem becomes is when your mulch rests against your plants, then the plant starts actually decomposing a little too, and then the wood bugs go for it. So like if you've got a melon that's sitting on the ground, you know, the wood bugs will come underneath and start nibbling away at the spot where the melon is sitting on the ground. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that one. I pick them out. I pick them up whenever I see them and put them in containers, and I try to get rid of them, but I've sort of given up because we have wood raised beds and we have wood chip paths in our garden. So it's like, it's a tough one. I have not noticed them so much at Lake Trail. Lake Trail is in Courtenay. It's drier than where I am at home. It's raised beds there, which are also drier. There's a little bit of wood bugs because we do have the wooden raised beds, but it's not anywhere near as problematic. So what they like is that moist sort of decomposing wood. That's their where they like to live, and also what they like to eat. So if that's abundant in your garden, you're going to have wood bugs. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks so much, Elaine. This has been another fantastic workshop. I learned so much, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it too. Thanks everybody for for zooming in. And we have, as of now, these workshops on a bi-weekly basis. So in 2 weeks, we'll be back here with Elaine talking about edible landscaping. And then we will have 2 more sessions in June, also on a bi-weekly, is it bi-weekly? Sorry, I'm not Canadian. Bi-weekly basis. And we'll be talking about urban permaculture and planning a winter harvest. And if funding and donations allow, and if Elaine stays up for it, we might be adding more sessions because we feel that the interest is there. So feel free to send over your questions, and please share this with friends and fellow gardeners. And again, a huge thank you to Elaine, and a thank you to Chuck for helping me in the beginning. That was a very, very great move, actually. And I hope to see everybody on here, and have you all back online here in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Lydia.
You have a lovely evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.